The silence that fell over the Rodriguez family's backyard barbecue was deafening as Carol Rodriguez held up her phone, showing everyone the photo she'd just posted on Facebook. Her voice carried that particular tone of satisfaction mixed with righteousness as she announced to the gathered family and friends that they'd finally gotten rid of that old eyesore that had been taking up space in their garage for the past 2 years. The piano, she explained with a dismissive wave of her hand, had been sold to help fund her nephew Brandon's promising new business venture, and wasn't it wonderful how the family could come together to support entrepreneurship and innovation? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I felt my stomach drop as I stared at the image on her screen, a picture of my mother's 1920s Steinway Baby Grand, being loaded onto a moving truck by 2 men who clearly had no idea what they were handling. The same piano where my mother had spent countless hours teaching me to play Chopin and Debussy, where she'd composed her own pieces late into the evening, while I did homework at the kitchen table, listening to the gentle melodies drifting through our small Portland apartment. The same piano that had been her most treasured possession and the last physical connection I had to the woman who'd raised me alone after my father left when I was 7. What Carol Rodriguez didn't know, what none of the Rodriguez family had bothered to discover despite having possession of the instrument for 2 years, was that 3 months ago I'd quietly taken the piano to Morrison's antique appraisals on Central Avenue for a professional evaluation. The certified appraiser, an elderly gentleman named Walter Morrison who'd been in the business for over 40 years, had spent nearly 3 hours examining every detail of the instrument with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. His final assessment, delivered in a voice filled with genuine awe, had made my hands shake as I held the official documentation. The piano wasn't just a family heirloom or sentimental keepsake. It was a genuine 1923 Steinway Model M Baby Grand, one of only a few hundred, produced during a specific period when the company was experimenting with a particular type of soundboard construction that had never been replicated. The serial number placed it among instruments that had been personally overseen by Heinrich Steinweg's descendants, and the pristine condition of the action and original ivory keys made it extraordinarily rare. Walter Morrison's official appraisal valued the instrument at $847,000, with a notation that similar pieces had sold at auction for well over $1 million when accompanied by proper provenance documentation. My name is Emma Chen, and I'd been married to David Rodriguez for 4 years, long enough to understand exactly how his family operated and what they thought of me. To the Rodriguez clan, I was the quiet, artsy daughter-in-law who taught piano lessons to neighborhood kids and didn't quite fit into their loud, boisterous family dynamic. They saw someone who preferred reading books to watching football, who declined their frequent invitations to casino trips and lake weekends, and who never seemed to contribute anything meaningful to their conversations about business, sports, or local gossip. What they failed to understand was that my reserved nature wasn't social anxiety or snobbishness. It was the learned behavior of someone who'd grown up watching every word and gesture because there was never enough money to make mistakes. My mother had worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat after my father abandoned us, cleaning offices at night, teaching piano lessons during the day, and performing at hotel lounges on weekends. She'd instilled in me the importance of education, hard work, and the quiet dignity that comes from knowing your worth, even when others can't see it. I'd met David at Arizona State University, where I was completing my master's degree in music education while working as a teaching assistant to cover tuition costs. He was finishing his business degree with plans to join his family's construction company, and there was something appealing about his easy confidence and the way he talked about his close-knit family with genuine affection. Our early relationship had been built on what seemed like complementary differences. His outgoing nature balanced my introversion, his financial security offered stability I'd never experienced, and his family's warmth appeared to provide the sense of belonging I'd craved since losing my mother to cancer during my junior year. The Rodriguez family had welcomed me initially with the kind of enthusiastic acceptance that I'd mistaken for genuine affection. Carol Rodriguez had insisted I call her Mom, Frank had made jokes about finally having someone in the family with culture and class, and David's siblings had treated me like an interesting novelty who might civilize their rough-around-the-edges brother. For the first year of our relationship, I'd felt like I'd finally found the family I'd always dreamed of having. The shift began gradually, so subtly that I didn't recognize it as deliberate until much later. Carol's suggestions about my wardrobe became more frequent and pointed, with comments about how certain colors or styles might be more flattering or appropriate for family gatherings. Frank's jokes about my vegetarian diet and preference for wine over beer evolved into concerned discussions about whether I was getting enough protein or if my food choices were some kind of eating disorder. Jessica and Tommy started making observations about my social habits, wondering aloud if I was feeling okay when I declined their invitations to bars or chose to leave parties early. The piano became a particular source of tension after my mother passed away and I inherited her belongings. David and I were living in a small apartment that couldn't accommodate such a large instrument, so Frank had generously offered to store it in their spacious 3-car garage until we could find a permanent solution. At the time, I'd been grateful for their willingness to help during such a difficult period, and their casual assurances that there was no rush to move it had seemed like genuine family support. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly the piano would transform from a temporary storage situation into a symbol of everything the Rodriguez family found problematic about my character and priorities. Carol began making comments about the space it was taking up, suggesting that perhaps it was time to let go of the past and focus on building a future with David. Frank wondered aloud why anyone would keep such an old instrument when modern digital pianos could sound just as good and take up a fraction of the space. Jessica and Tommy started referring to it as Emma's emotional baggage, treating my attachment to my mother's memory as evidence of an unhealthy inability to move forward. The pressure to sell the piano intensified after David and I got married and moved into a larger house that theoretically could have accommodated the instrument. By then, however, the Rodriguez family had developed a comprehensive narrative about why keeping the piano represented poor decision-making and misplaced priorities. They argued that the space in our new home should be used for practical purposes, like a home office for David, or a guest room for visiting family members. They suggested that the money from selling the piano could be invested in home improvements, or saved for our future children's education. Most persuasively, they presented the sale as an opportunity to demonstrate my commitment to building a new life with David rather than clinging to remnants of my previous existence. Carol had become particularly skilled at framing the issue in terms of marital harmony and family unity, suggesting that my resistance to selling the piano indicated selfish tendencies that could damage our relationship. She'd developed a repertoire of concerned observations about marriages that failed because one spouse couldn't release their attachment to things that prevented full emotional investment in their new family. The manipulation was sophisticated in its subtlety, never crossing into outright demands or ultimatums, but creating constant pressure through repeated suggestions and psychological analysis of my motivations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They positioned themselves as caring family members who wanted what was best for David and me, while portraying my desire to keep my mother's piano as evidence of emotional immaturity or psychological problems that needed to be addressed for the sake of our marriage. David's role in these discussions was particularly painful because he seemed genuinely conflicted between supporting his wife and maintaining family harmony. He never directly told me to sell the piano, but he also never defended my right to keep it when his family raised their concerns. Instead, he would listen to their arguments with thoughtful nods and then approach me with careful suggestions about compromise and the importance of being flexible in marriage. His unwillingness to take a clear position felt like a betrayal, though I understood the difficult position his family's pressure had created. The situation became more complicated when Brandon Martinez, Frank's nephew from his sister's side of the family, moved to Phoenix after graduating from college with grand plans to start an environmental consulting business. Brandon was 24 years old with an engineering degree from Northern Arizona University, and the kind of infectious enthusiasm that made his business ideas sound revolutionary, even when they were recycled concepts he'd read about in entrepreneurship magazines. Ecotech Solutions, as Brandon had named his venture, was supposed to help small businesses reduce their environmental impact while saving money through improved efficiency and sustainable practices. He'd created an impressive presentation, complete with charts showing potential market size and projected revenue growth, and he'd managed to secure a small office space in a converted warehouse that he shared with 3 other startups. What he lacked was the initial capital needed to purchase equipment, hire employees, and market his services to potential clients. The Rodriguez family had embraced Brandon's entrepreneurial ambitions with the kind of enthusiasm they'd never shown for my music teaching or artistic pursuits. Frank spoke with genuine pride about having an entrepreneur in the family, while Carol organized dinner parties where Brandon could present his business plan to their friends and potential investors. Jessica and Tommy treated him like a celebrity, constantly asking about his progress and sharing his social media posts about business development and networking events. When Brandon mentioned needing startup capital to get ecotech solutions off the ground, the family immediately began brainstorming ways to help him succeed. Frank offered to invest his own money, but Brandon insisted on keeping family financial relationships separate from business transactions. Carol suggested organizing a family fundraising effort, but Brandon wanted to prove he could attract investment based on merit rather than family connections. Tommy proposed taking out loans, but Brandon preferred to avoid debt that could limit his flexibility during the crucial early stages of business development. The solution, when it finally emerged during a family barbecue in early June, seemed so obvious that everyone wondered why they hadn't thought of it sooner. Carol was complaining about the garage space being occupied by my mother's piano when Jessica mentioned Brandon's ongoing search for startup funding. Frank connected the dots immediately, suggesting that the piano could be sold to provide Brandon with the capital he needed, while simultaneously solving the storage problem that had been bothering Carol for months. The idea gained momentum quickly as family members added their own supporting arguments. The piano was just sitting in storage, serving no practical purpose, while Brandon needed immediate funding to capitalize on what appeared to be a promising business opportunity. Selling an unused musical instrument to help launch a family member's career seemed like exactly the kind of mutual support that strong families provided for each other. Most importantly, the transaction would demonstrate everyone's commitment to practical problem solving rather than sentimental attachment to objects that served no current function. When the family presented their proposal to me, they framed it as an opportunity for everyone to benefit from a creative solution to multiple problems. I would no longer need to worry about storage costs or space limitations. Brandon would receive the funding necessary to launch his business, and the family would have contributed to an entrepreneurial success story that could eventually benefit everyone. They emphasized the temporary nature of the arrangement, suggesting that once ecotech solutions became profitable, Brandon could repay the loan with interest, effectively making the piano sale an investment rather than a permanent loss. The pressure to agree was enormous, not because of any direct threats or ultimatums, but because refusing would have required explaining why I valued a piece of furniture more than my cousin-in-law's future success. The Rodriguez family had positioned the request as a simple favor between family members, the kind of mutual support that people who cared about each other provided without hesitation. Saying no would have branded me as selfish, unsupportive, and more attached to material possessions than to family relationships. David's response when I expressed reservations about the plan was disappointing but entirely predictable. He understood my emotional attachment to the piano, he assured me, but he also thought his family's proposal made practical sense. The instrument wasn't being used for its intended purpose. Brandon's business opportunity had significant potential, and the money could be put to better use than letting an expensive asset sit in storage indefinitely. He suggested that my reluctance might be based more on stubbornness than legitimate concerns, and he encouraged me to consider what my mother would have wanted me to do in this situation. The implication that my mother would have wanted me to sell her most prized possession to fund a stranger's business venture felt like a deliberate manipulation designed to make me question my own judgment and motivations. David knew how much I'd loved and respected my mother, and suggesting that keeping her piano contradicted her values was a particularly cruel way to pressure me into compliance with his family's wishes. But the most devastating aspect of the entire situation was the casual assumption that my opinion about disposing of my own inheritance was merely advisory rather than decisive. The Rodriguez family had discussed, debated, and essentially decided to sell my mother's piano without ever acknowledging that the decision wasn't theirs to make. They treated my ownership of the instrument as a technicality that could be overruled by family consensus and practical considerations. When I finally agreed to the sale, it wasn't because I believed their arguments or thought Brandon's business deserved my support. It was because I realized that refusing would have created a family crisis, that would have been blamed entirely on my selfishness and inability to prioritize family relationships over material possessions. The choice wasn't really between keeping the piano or helping Brandon. It was between maintaining peace with David's family or being branded as the difficult daughter-in-law who put her own interests above everyone else's well-being. The actual sale process was handled entirely by Frank and Carol, who found a buyer through their network of business contacts and negotiated what they assured me was a fair price for such an old instrument. They were pleased to announce that they'd gotten $3,500 for the piano, money that would provide Brandon with exactly the startup capital he needed to purchase initial equipment and begin marketing Ecotech solutions to potential clients. I hadn't shared the appraisal information with anyone in the Rodriguez family, partly because I wanted to protect myself from the additional pressure that would have come with revealing the piano's true value, and partly because I was curious to see how they would handle the transaction without understanding what they were actually selling. The $3,500 they'd accepted represented less than 0.5% of the piano's actual worth, a difference so enormous that it bordered on criminal negligence. But as I stood in their backyard listening to Carol announce the sale to their friends and neighbors, watching Brandon accept congratulations for his good fortune in having such a supportive family, I felt something shift inside me that went beyond anger or disappointment. For the first time in 4 years of marriage, I saw the Rodriguez family clearly for what they really were: people who took what they wanted while convincing themselves they were being generous and supportive. The silence that had fallen over the barbecue when Carol made her announcement wasn't the respectful quiet of people processing important information. It was the uncomfortable pause that occurs when people realize they've witnessed something that might not be entirely appropriate. Several guests were looking at me with expressions of sympathy or concern, clearly understanding that selling someone's inherited piano without their enthusiastic consent might not represent the family harmony that Carol was celebrating. Angela Martinez, Brandon's mother and Frank's sister, was the first person to speak after Carol's announcement. Her voice carried a note of uncertainty as she asked whether I was completely comfortable with the arrangement, and whether there might have been other solutions to Brandon's funding needs that didn't require selling my mother's piano. Her question created an opening for me to express any reservations I might have about the transaction, but it also put me in the position of either publicly supporting the family's decision or creating awkwardness by voicing objections. The moments stretched endlessly as everyone waited for my response, and I realized that this was likely my last opportunity to salvage any part of my mother's legacy from the Rodriguez family's well-intentioned but devastating generosity. But I also understood that speaking up now would accomplish nothing beyond creating the kind of family drama that would be blamed entirely on my inability to gracefully accept help and support from people who loved me. Instead, I smiled and expressed my happiness that the piano could contribute to Brandon's success, even as something inside me began calculating exactly what that success had cost, and whether the Rodriguez family would ever understand the magnitude of what they'd casually discarded in pursuit of their own definition of practical family support. The story of how I discovered my mother's piano was worth nearly $1 million begins with a chance encounter at the Phoenix Public Library 6 months before the Rodriguez family decided to solve their storage problem and Brandon's funding crisis with one convenient transaction. I had been researching music therapy techniques for a special needs student when I overheard 2 elderly women discussing an upcoming estate sale that would feature several antique musical instruments. One of them mentioned having a Steinway piano appraised years earlier and being shocked to discover its true value, which had been far beyond anything her family had imagined possible. The conversation planted a seed of curiosity that grew stronger over the following weeks as I found myself wondering about my mother's piano and whether it might be worth more than the few $1,000s I'd always assumed. My mother had never discussed the instrument's monetary value, focusing instead on its musical capabilities and the joy it brought to our small apartment. She'd inherited it from her own piano teacher, Mrs. Eleanor Hartford, who had purchased it new in 1923 and maintained it meticulously throughout her long career as a performer and instructor. Mrs. Hartford had been my mother's mentor during her teenage years in Portland, the woman who had encouraged her to pursue music professionally despite her family's concerns about financial stability in such an uncertain career. When Mrs. Hartford passed away at 91, she'd left the piano to my mother with a handwritten note expressing her hope that it would continue bringing beautiful music into the world through another generation of dedicated musicians. My mother had treasured that connection to her beloved teacher almost as much as she'd loved the instrument itself. What I remembered most clearly about the piano from my childhood was its extraordinary sound quality, and the way my mother's face would light up whenever she played it. Even our neighbors in the cramped apartment building had complimented the rich, warm tones that seemed to fill every room with music that felt alive and vibrant. My mother had often told me that good pianos had personalities, and this one had always seemed particularly responsive to her touch, as if it understood exactly what emotions she was trying to convey through each piece. The decision to have the piano appraised required careful planning because I knew the Rodriguez family would have strong opinions about any action that might delay or complicate their preferred timeline for clearing out their garage space. I scheduled the appointment for a Thursday morning when David was at work and Carol had her weekly book club meeting, ensuring that I could transport the appraiser to their house without having to explain my intentions or defend my decision to spend money on what they would undoubtedly consider an unnecessary professional service. Walter Morrison from Morrison's Antique Appraisals arrived precisely on time, a distinguished gentleman in his 70s who moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had spent decades handling irreplaceable objects. His initial examination of the piano was conducted in complete silence, as he checked the serial number, inspected the keyboard action, and examined the soundboard with a small flashlight and magnifying glass. His growing excitement was evident in the way his movements became more focused, and his breathing seemed to quicken as he discovered each new detail about the instrument's construction and condition. The technical aspects of his evaluation were fascinating and educational in ways I hadn't anticipated. He explained that Steinway pianos from the early 1920s represented a particular pinnacle of craftsmanship, created during a period when the company was experimenting with soundboard designs that would never be replicated due to changes in available materials and manufacturing techniques. The specific wood used for the soundboard came from trees that had been aged for decades before construction, creating tonal qualities that modern instruments simply couldn't match regardless of their price or prestige. More importantly, he discovered that my mother's piano bore the personal inspection marks of Heinrich Steinweg's grandson, indicating that it had received individual attention from family members who personally oversaw the construction of only the most exceptional instruments. The serial number placed it among fewer than 300 pianos produced during a 6-month window when the company was perfecting techniques that would influence their manufacturing processes for the next century. Walter spent considerable time examining the original ivory keys, which remained in pristine condition despite nearly a century of use. Most pianos from this era had been retrofitted with synthetic key coverings due to wear or damage, but my mother and Mrs. Hartford before her had maintained the instrument so carefully that the original materials remained intact and functional. The preservation of these original components increased the piano's value exponentially, as collectors and musicians valued authenticity above almost any other consideration. The most remarkable discovery came when Walter examined the piano's internal mechanisms and found that the original hammers, strings, and action components had never been replaced or significantly modified. This level of preservation was virtually unheard of in instruments that had been actively played for decades, and it suggested that both Mrs. Hartford and my mother had possessed exceptional knowledge about proper piano maintenance and care. The combination of original components, excellent preservation, and the instrument's documented provenance created what Walter described as a perfect storm of factors that made the piano extraordinarily valuable to collectors and museums. When Walter finally delivered his preliminary assessment, I felt my legs weaken and had to sit down on Frank's workbench to process what he was telling me. The piano wasn't just a valuable antique or a piece with sentimental worth to our family. It was a museum-quality instrument that represented one of the finest examples of early 20th century American piano manufacturing still in private hands. Similar instruments had sold at auction for prices that reached well into 7 figures when accompanied by proper documentation and provenance research. His formal written appraisal, which arrived by certified mail 3 days later, placed the conservative estimated value at $847,000, with notation that recent auction results for comparable instruments had exceeded $1 million when market conditions were favorable. The document included detailed photographs of the piano's distinguishing features, copies of relevant manufacturing records from Steinway's archives, and a comprehensive analysis of factors that contributed to its exceptional value in the current antique musical instrument market. Reading through Walter's detailed report felt like discovering a hidden treasure that had been sitting in plain sight for my entire life. Every technical specification and historical detail reinforced just how extraordinary my mother's piano truly was, and how completely the Rodriguez family had misunderstood what they were handling when they casually offered to store it in their garage, alongside paint cans and garden equipment. The casual way Frank had moved it with a furniture dolly and amateur helpers suddenly seemed criminally negligent given what Walter's appraisal had revealed about its true significance and value. But the financial implications of the appraisal were almost less important than what it revealed about my mother's life and the sacrifices she'd made to preserve something beautiful for future generations. Mrs. Hartford's gift hadn't just been a musical instrument. It had been a legacy that connected 3 generations of women who had dedicated their lives to music and education. My mother had worked multiple jobs and lived frugally for decades to maintain an instrument that was worth more than most people's houses, never complaining about the expense or considering selling it despite the financial security it could have provided. The realization that my mother had possessed something so valuable while struggling to pay rent and medical bills added layers of complexity to my grief that I was still processing months later. She could have sold the piano at any point and lived comfortably for the rest of her life, but she'd chosen instead to preserve it for me, with the hope that I would understand its significance and continue the tradition of music and teaching that had defined her own identity and purpose. Understanding the true value of my inheritance also cast the Rodriguez family's treatment of the piano in a completely different light. Their casual dismissal of its worth wasn't just ignorance or lack of appreciation for musical instruments. It was a fundamental failure to recognize that other people's possessions might have significance beyond their immediate understanding. The assumption that an old piano couldn't be worth more than a few $1,000s revealed how completely they'd underestimated both my mother's judgment and my own knowledge about things that mattered to me. The weight of this secret knowledge became increasingly difficult to bear as the pressure to sell the piano intensified throughout the spring months. Every conversation about garage space and family priorities felt like a deliberate test of my ability to withstand psychological manipulation, while protecting information that would have changed the entire dynamic if revealed. The Rodriguez family's arguments about practicality and moving forward with life took on a surreal quality when I understood that they were essentially pressuring me to give away nearly $1 million to solve a storage problem that could have been addressed in dozens of other ways. David's role in these discussions became particularly painful once I understood what was actually at stake. His willingness to support his family's position without investigating the piano's true value revealed how little he understood about my background or the sacrifices my mother had made to preserve something beautiful for future generations. His casual suggestion that we could always buy another piano if I wanted to continue playing demonstrated a complete failure to comprehend the difference between a musical instrument and a piece of family history that connected me to the most important relationship of my life. The most frustrating aspect of maintaining secrecy about the appraisal was watching Brandon Martinez present his business plan to the family with such confidence and enthusiasm, while knowing that his entire startup budget could be funded with less than half of 1% of what my piano was actually worth. Ecotech Solutions represented exactly the kind of trendy environmental consulting that inexperienced entrepreneurs mistook for revolutionary thinking, and Brandon's projections about market size and revenue potential revealed the same combination of optimism and ignorance that characterized most failed business ventures. His presentations to the family featured the kind of recycled ideas about sustainability and efficiency that had been circulating in business magazines for decades, repackaged with enthusiasm that convinced his relatives they were witnessing the birth of the next great American success story. The environmental consulting market was already saturated with established firms that had actual track records and professional credentials, but Brandon's youth and family connections had created a bubble of supportive encouragement that insulated him from realistic assessment of his prospects for success. Frank Rodriguez's pride in having an entrepreneur in the family was particularly galling given his complete dismissal of my own professional accomplishments as a music educator and private instructor. He spoke about Brandon's business acumen and innovative thinking with the same reverence that other people reserved for discussing Nobel Prize winners, while treating my work with children and adults as a pleasant hobby that didn't require serious consideration or respect. The double standard was so obvious that I wondered how someone who considered himself a successful businessman could be so completely blind to his own biases and assumptions. Carol's enthusiasm for Brandon's venture seemed to stem largely from her excitement about having family members who fit her definition of ambitious and success-oriented, categories that apparently excluded teaching music or working with students who had learning disabilities. Her constant praise for Brandon's presentations and networking efforts contrasted sharply with her subtle criticism of my preference for working with individual students rather than pursuing opportunities in more traditional educational settings that might offer better financial prospects and social recognition. The family's financial contribution to Ecotech Solutions had been presented as a way for everyone to participate in supporting Brandon's dreams, while solving practical problems that benefited multiple people simultaneously. Frank had offered to invest his own money, but Brandon's insistence on maintaining separation between family relationships and business transactions had been portrayed as evidence of his professional integrity and sophisticated understanding of entrepreneurial best practices. The decision to sell my piano instead of accepting direct financial support was framed as a creative solution that honored Brandon's principles while providing him with the capital he needed to launch his venture. What none of them understood was that Brandon's reluctance to accept family money probably had less to do with professional ethics and more to do with his awareness that Ecotech Solutions was unlikely to generate returns that would justify investment from people he cared about. Taking money from relatives created accountability and expectations that might become uncomfortable if the business failed to meet projected milestones for growth and profitability. Selling my piano allowed him to access capital without creating personal debt or ongoing financial obligations to family members who might expect regular updates and explanations about business performance. The irony of using nearly $1 million worth of musical heritage to fund a consulting business that would probably fail within 2 years was so profound that I found myself struggling to maintain composure during family discussions about the arrangement. Brandon's confidence about market demand for environmental consulting services was based on the same kind of wishful thinking that destroyed most startup ventures. But his family's enthusiasm for supporting his dreams had created an echo chamber where realistic assessment was impossible. As the date for the piano sale approached, I found myself experiencing a strange sense of anticipation, mixed with dread about what would happen when the transaction was completed and the instrument disappeared from my life forever. Part of me hoped that the buyer would recognize what they were purchasing and offer a more realistic price, but Walter Morrison had explained that most people who bought musical instruments through informal sales lacked the expertise to properly evaluate exceptional pieces. The likelihood was that my mother's piano would disappear into someone's living room, where its true significance would remain unknown until the owner eventually decided to sell it again. The emotional preparation for losing my mother's piano was complicated by my knowledge that the loss was completely unnecessary and based on the Rodriguez family's failure to understand what they were handling. If they had possessed even basic curiosity about the instrument's background or value, if they had asked a few simple questions about its history or condition, if they had shown minimal respect for my inheritance rights, the entire situation could have been avoided without anyone experiencing financial hardship or family conflict. Instead, their combination of ignorance, assumptions, and manipulative pressure had created circumstances where I faced the choice between preserving family harmony and protecting my mother's legacy. The decision to allow the sale wasn't based on agreement with their reasoning or acceptance of their values. It was a strategic retreat designed to avoid a confrontation that would have been blamed entirely on my selfishness and inability to prioritize family relationships over material possessions. But as I watched the moving truck disappear down the Rodriguez family's street carrying away the most valuable thing my mother had ever owned, I realized that maintaining peace with David's family had come at a cost that went far beyond financial loss. I had allowed people who neither understood nor respected my background to make decisions about my inheritance based on their own assumptions about value, importance, and family obligation. The precedent established by this transaction would influence every future interaction we had about money, priorities, and decision-making authority within our extended family structure. The silence that followed the piano's departure was different from the contemplative quiet that had filled our apartment when my mother played her evening concerts for an audience of one. This was the hollow absence of something irreplaceable that had been casually discarded by people who measured worth only in terms they could understand and control. The transformation in Brandon Martinez's behavior after receiving the money from my mother's piano sale was immediate and telling in ways that revealed the true nature of his business venture and his understanding of entrepreneurial responsibility. Within a week of the transaction, his social media accounts were filled with photos of expensive equipment purchases, a redesigned office space with custom furniture, and celebratory dinners at upscale restaurants where he entertained potential clients and business partners. The $3,500 that was supposed to fund his startup's initial operational expenses had apparently been absorbed into lifestyle improvements that suggested someone more interested in appearing successful than actually building a sustainable business. His presentations to the family about Ecotech Solutions' progress became increasingly vague and filled with business jargon that obscured rather than clarified what he was actually accomplishing with the capital we had provided. Brandon spoke enthusiastically about market penetration strategies, synergistic partnerships, and revolutionary approaches to environmental consulting, but when pressed for specific details about client acquisitions or revenue generation, his responses revealed someone who had confused activity with achievement and spending with investment. The office space that Brandon had leased with such pride turned out to be part of a co-working facility that specialized in housing failed startups and inexperienced entrepreneurs who needed affordable workspace and the illusion of professional legitimacy. His neighbors included a woman trying to sell handmade jewelry through social media, a man developing mobile apps that solved problems nobody actually had, and several college graduates who had convinced themselves that passion and determination could substitute for market research and business experience. What became increasingly obvious through Brandon's updates and casual conversations was that Ecotech Solutions had no actual clients, no proven methods for delivering the environmental improvements it promised, and no realistic timeline for generating revenue that would justify the confidence his family had shown in supporting his venture. The consulting services he planned to offer were based entirely on information he could gather from free online resources and business publications, repackaged with enthusiasm, but lacking the expertise and credibility that serious clients would demand from professional consultants. Frank Rodriguez's continued praise for Brandon's entrepreneurial spirit and innovative thinking created a family dynamic where questioning the venture's viability was treated as lack of support rather than reasonable concern about how our money was being used. Carol had begun referring to Brandon as, quote, our little businessman, with the kind of pride typically reserved for discussing children's achievements, and Jessica had started posting encouraging comments on his social media updates that treated every equipment purchase and networking event as evidence of imminent success. The most frustrating aspect of watching this elaborate performance was knowing that the money funding Brandon's pretend consulting business represented a tiny fraction of what my mother's piano was actually worth, but also understanding that revealing this information would create family chaos without recovering the instrument or preventing Brandon's inevitable failure. The piano was gone, sold to someone who had no idea what they had purchased, and exposing the Rodriguez family's ignorance would accomplish nothing beyond satisfying my desire for vindication at the cost of my marriage and relationships with people I still hoped might someday understand their mistakes. David's reaction to my growing skepticism about Brandon's business prospects revealed how thoroughly his loyalty remained divided between supporting his wife and maintaining family unity around decisions that had already been made. When I mentioned concerns about the lack of concrete progress reports or specific client achievements, David suggested that perhaps I didn't understand how environmental consulting worked, or how long such businesses typically took to establish themselves in competitive markets. His willingness to accept Brandon's vague explanations while dismissing my questions demonstrated the same pattern of selective credulity that had characterized the entire piano sale process. The deeper issue wasn't Brandon's inevitable business failure or the Rodriguez family's poor judgment about supporting unproven ventures, but rather their systematic inability to recognize value or expertise outside their own limited experience and assumptions. They had spent months analyzing my attachment to my mother's piano as evidence of emotional problems that needed intervention, while simultaneously embracing Brandon's grandiose business claims with enthusiasm that bordered on willful blindness. Their treatment of my music teaching career followed similar patterns of dismissal disguised as concern and support. Carol frequently suggested that I might consider transitioning into more stable employment that offered better benefits and advancement opportunities, as if working with students and helping them develop musical skills was a temporary phase, rather than a legitimate professional calling. Frank wondered aloud whether the stress of managing multiple private students might be affecting my emotional well-being, particularly given my tendency toward introversion and preference for quiet activities over social engagements. The implication that my career choice represented some kind of failure to launch into appropriate adult responsibilities was particularly insulting, given that my private teaching practice generated more reliable income than most entry-level positions in traditional employment settings. My students included children whose parents paid premium rates for quality instruction, adults pursuing lifelong dreams of musical literacy, and several individuals with learning disabilities who required specialized teaching techniques that few instructors were qualified to provide. What the Rodriguez family consistently failed to understand was that my preference for working independently reflected deliberate choices about professional autonomy and meaningful engagement, rather than inability to succeed in more conventional work environments. I had turned down several offers to join music schools and educational institutions because I valued the flexibility to design curricula that met individual student needs, and the satisfaction of seeing people achieve goals that other instructors had told them were impossible. My mother had built her own teaching practice using similar principles, refusing offers from established music schools because she believed individual attention and customized instruction produced better results than standardized programs designed for administrative convenience rather than student success. Her reputation among parents and professional musicians had grown through word-of-mouth recommendations based on actual achievements rather than institutional credentials or marketing campaigns. The legacy she had left me included not only her physical piano but also her approach to music education as a form of personal service that prioritized student development over instructor convenience or profit maximization. Every lesson I taught, and every student who discovered new capabilities through patient, individualized instruction, represented a continuation of values and methods that had defined her professional identity for over 3 decades. But the Rodriguez family's casual dismissal of this inheritance felt like another form of theft, perhaps even more damaging than their appropriation of my mother's piano, because it attacked the meaning and purpose of work that connected me to everything I had learned from her about dedication, service, and the importance of preserving beautiful traditions through teaching and example. The environmental consulting market that Brandon was attempting to enter was already dominated by established firms with proven track records, professional credentials, and existing relationships with corporate clients who valued experience over enthusiasm. His belief that passion and determination could substitute for expertise and reputation reflected the same kind of magical thinking that destroyed most startup ventures before they generated sufficient revenue to cover basic operating expenses. Real environmental consulting required extensive knowledge of regulatory requirements, industry-specific challenges, and technical solutions that took years to develop through education and practical experience. Brandon's engineering degree provided theoretical background that might eventually support consulting work, but his complete lack of field experience and professional credentials made it unlikely that serious clients would trust him with projects that could affect their regulatory compliance or operational efficiency. The equipment purchases that Brandon had made with such excitement represented another fundamental misunderstanding of how consulting businesses actually operated. Environmental assessment often required expensive, specialized instruments, but successful consultants typically leased equipment for specific projects rather than purchasing tools that would sit unused between client engagements. His decision to buy rather than rent suggested someone more interested in owning impressive equipment than understanding the financial realities of professional service businesses. Most importantly, Brandon's entire approach to marketing and client development revealed someone who had confused networking events and social media presence with actual business development activities that generated paying customers. He spent enormous amounts of time attending entrepreneurship meetups and posting inspirational content about environmental responsibility, but he had no systematic approach to identifying potential clients, understanding their specific needs, or demonstrating how his services could solve problems they actually faced. The 3 months following the piano sale provided ample evidence that Ecotech Solutions was following the predictable trajectory of most amateur business ventures, burning through initial capital on unnecessary expenses while failing to generate revenue or establish relationships with paying clients. Brandon's monthly updates to the family became increasingly focused on future opportunities and potential partnerships, rather than current achievements or measurable progress toward sustainability and profitability. His reluctance to provide specific financial information about business performance suggested someone who understood that honest reporting would reveal the gap between his optimistic projections and actual results. When Frank asked direct questions about client acquisitions or revenue generation, Brandon would respond with complex explanations about market development timelines and relationship-building strategies that obscured, rather than clarified, what he was actually accomplishing with our investment. The office space lease that Brandon had signed with such pride was scheduled for renewal after 6 months, creating a natural deadline for evaluating whether Ecotech Solutions had generated sufficient business activity to justify continued investment in professional workspace. His growing anxiety about meeting this financial obligation became apparent through casual comments about possibly transitioning to a home-based operation or finding shared office arrangements that would reduce overhead costs. But perhaps the most telling indicator of Brandon's business trajectory was his decision to begin offering services outside his stated area of expertise, taking on projects that had little connection to environmental consulting, but provided immediate payment for work he could complete without specialized knowledge or equipment. These survival contracts included basic business analysis for small retailers, social media management for local service providers, and administrative support for other entrepreneurs who needed temporary assistance with routine tasks. The transformation of Ecotech Solutions from revolutionary environmental consulting firm to general business services provider happened so gradually that the Rodriguez family initially failed to recognize it as evidence of fundamental problems with Brandon's original business model. Carol praised his flexibility and willingness to help other small business owners, while Frank admired his practical approach to generating cash flow during the early stages of business development. What they didn't understand was that Brandon's diversification into unrelated services represented abandonment of his environmental consulting ambitions, rather than strategic expansion of his professional capabilities. Real consulting businesses succeeded by developing deep expertise in specific areas and building reputations for solving particular types of problems, not by accepting any available work that provided immediate payment regardless of its connection to stated business objectives. The deterioration of Brandon's original business plan coincided with increasingly frequent requests for additional family support, though these appeals were presented as temporary assistance rather than admission that his initial projections had been unrealistic. He needed help with office rent because a major client had delayed their payment schedule. He required additional equipment because an unexpected opportunity had arisen that could lead to a significant contract. He wanted to attend expensive conferences and training programs that would enhance his professional credentials and expand his network of potential partners. Each request was accompanied by optimistic explanations about how this particular investment would transform Ecotech Solutions into the successful venture that everyone had envisioned when they agreed to sell my mother's piano to fund his entrepreneurial dreams. Brandon's ability to maintain enthusiasm despite mounting evidence of failure was remarkable in its persistence, suggesting someone who had convinced himself that setbacks were temporary obstacles rather than indicators of fundamental problems with his approach to business development. The psychological dynamics within the Rodriguez family during this period revealed how invested they had become in Brandon's success as validation of their own judgment and decision-making capabilities. Acknowledging that Ecotech Solutions was failing would have required admitting that they had pressured me to sell a valuable family heirloom to support a venture that had been doomed from the beginning, a recognition that would have challenged their self-perception as practical people who made sound decisions based on realistic assessment of opportunities and risks. Instead, they chose to interpret every setback as evidence of Brandon's perseverance and commitment to building something meaningful, despite temporary difficulties. His pivot away from environmental consulting was reframed as smart business strategy. His requests for additional funding were viewed as responsible planning for growth opportunities, and his failure to generate significant revenue was explained as the natural timeline for establishing professional services businesses in competitive markets. The most painful aspect of watching this elaborate denial process was understanding that my mother's piano had been sacrificed not for a legitimate business opportunity, that might have justified the emotional cost of losing my inheritance. But for an amateur venture that was always destined to fail, because it was based on unrealistic assumptions and inadequate preparation. The $3,500 that had seemed like generous family support for promising entrepreneurship had actually purchased nothing more than a few months of expensive experimentation by someone who lacked the knowledge, experience, and realistic planning necessary for business success. But revealing what I knew about the piano's true value would have accomplished nothing beyond creating family conflict and exposing my own complicity in allowing the sale to proceed despite understanding its implications. The instrument was gone, Brandon's business was failing predictably, and the Rodriguez family had learned nothing from the experience, except that their faith in supporting family members' dreams sometimes required ongoing financial commitment that exceeded original expectations. The decision to investigate exactly who had purchased my mother's piano came from a combination of curiosity and growing anger about the casual way the Rodriguez family had disposed of something they never bothered to understand. Frank had mentioned selling it to someone through his network of business contacts, but he'd been characteristically vague about details when I asked follow-up questions about the buyer's identity or intentions for the instrument. His dismissive attitude suggested that once the transaction was complete and Brandon had his startup money, the piano's destination was irrelevant to anyone except me and my supposed inability to let go of the past. The investigation began with simple online searches using the piano's serial number and descriptions of its distinctive features, hoping to find auction listings or sales advertisements that might reveal where the instrument had ended up. Steinway pianos were tracked carefully by collectors and dealers, and instruments with unusual provenance or exceptional condition often appeared in specialized databases maintained by enthusiasts and professional appraisers who monitored the market for significant pieces. What I discovered through these searches was far more complex and disturbing than I had anticipated. My mother's piano hadn't been sold to a music lover or collector who would appreciate its historical significance and exceptional quality. Instead, it had been purchased by Marcus Webb, a local businessman who specialized in flipping valuable items through quick resale to buyers who paid premium prices for authentic antiques and collectibles, without conducting thorough research about market values or provenance. Marcus Webb operated what appeared to be a legitimate antique business from a warehouse facility in North Phoenix, but his actual method involved identifying undervalued items being sold by people who lacked expertise about what they owned, purchasing these pieces at fraction of their true worth, and reselling them to collectors and dealers who paid market rates for properly identified and documented antiques. His business model depended on the ignorance of original owners and the knowledge gaps of intermediate buyers who created arbitrage opportunities for someone with sufficient expertise to recognize value that others missed. The most infuriating discovery was that Marcus Webb had immediately recognized what he was purchasing when Frank contacted him about an old Steinway piano that was taking up garage space. Webb's background included 15 years of experience dealing in musical instruments and antiques, and he would have identified the piano's significance within minutes of examining its serial number and construction details. His offer of $3,500 represented a calculated lowball bid designed to take advantage of the Rodriguez family's ignorance while providing enough money to make them feel satisfied with the transaction. Further research revealed that Marcus Webb had already begun the process of reselling my mother's piano through Hartwell Auctions, a prestigious firm in Los Angeles that specialized in high-end musical instruments and attracted serious collectors willing to pay substantial sums for exceptional pieces. The preliminary auction listing described the piano in terms that emphasized its rarity, pristine condition, and historical significance, with estimated bidding expected to begin at $400,000 and potentially reach well over $1 million depending on interest from museums and private collectors. The transformation of my family heirloom from garage clutter, worth $3,500, into a museum-quality auction piece, expected to sell for close to $1 million within 6 months, perfectly illustrated the extent of the Rodriguez family's ignorance and the predatory nature of Marcus Webb's business practices. He had identified an opportunity to profit from their assumptions about value, while they remained completely unaware that they had been systematically deceived by someone who specialized in exploiting exactly this type of knowledge gap. The documentation I was able to gather about the upcoming auction included detailed photographs and technical descriptions that confirmed everything Walter Morrison had told me about the piano's exceptional characteristics and historical importance. The auction house's research had uncovered additional provenance information that traced the instrument's ownership history back to its original purchase in 1923, including documentation about Mrs. Hartford's career as a performer and her connections to other prominent musicians of her era. Reading through the auction house's scholarly analysis of my mother's piano felt like discovering a detailed biography of someone I had lived with for years, without understanding their true identity or significance. Every technical specification and historical detail reinforced how completely the Rodriguez family had misunderstood what they were handling when they casually decided to convert my inheritance into startup capital for Brandon's doomed consulting venture. But perhaps the most painful aspect of learning about the auction was understanding that my mother's piano would soon belong to someone who could afford to bid hundreds of thousands of dollars for a musical instrument, while my family had been convinced to sell it for less money than most people spent on used cars. The buyer would likely be a wealthy collector or museum that would preserve the piano's historical significance and provide it with the care and respect it deserved, but they would never understand its personal meaning or the sacrifices my mother had made to maintain something beautiful for future generations. The research process also revealed disturbing information about Marcus Webb's business practices and his reputation within the antique and collectibles community. Several online forums and trade publications included discussions about his methods for identifying undervalued items and his willingness to take advantage of sellers who lacked expertise about what they owned. He had built his business by systematically exploiting information asymmetries, targeting estates, sales, garage sales, and private transactions where emotional or financial pressure created opportunities to purchase valuable items at a fraction of their true worth. Other victims of Marcus Webb's practices included elderly people selling family heirlooms to cover medical expenses, divorced individuals liquidating assets during financial emergencies, and executors of estates who lacked time or knowledge to properly research the value of inherited items. His business model was entirely legal but ethically questionable, representing a form of sophisticated exploitation that targeted people during vulnerable periods when they needed money quickly and couldn't afford professional appraisal services. The realization that the Rodriguez family had been specifically targeted by someone who made his living from their type of ignorance added another layer of anger to my growing resentment about how the entire situation had been handled. Frank's pride in finding a buyer through his business network had actually led him directly to a predator who specialized in exactly the kind of transaction they had initiated, and their satisfaction with receiving $3,500 for garage clutter had played perfectly into Marcus Webb's standard operating procedures for acquiring valuable items at minimal cost. But the most disturbing discovery came when I found evidence that Marcus Webb had specifically sought out information about the Rodriguez family's piano after hearing rumors about a Steinway being stored in someone's garage. He had cultivated relationships with several local moving companies and storage facilities to learn about valuable items that owners might be willing to sell, and he had positioned himself as a helpful businessman who could solve people's storage problems while providing fair compensation for items they no longer needed. The systematic nature of his approach to identifying and acquiring my mother's piano suggested that the Rodriguez family hadn't simply made a bad decision based on ignorance and family pressure, but had been deliberately manipulated by someone who recognized an opportunity to profit from their assumptions about value and their eagerness to solve multiple problems with one convenient transaction. Their belief that they had found a win-win solution that helped Brandon while clearing garage space had been carefully cultivated by someone whose business depended on creating exactly these types of circumstances. Armed with this information about Marcus Webb's practices and the upcoming auction, I faced the decision of whether to inform the Rodriguez family about what had actually happened to my mother's piano and how thoroughly they had been deceived by someone who specialized in exploiting their particular combination of ignorance and good intentions. Revealing the truth would certainly create family chaos and potentially provide grounds for legal action against Marcus Webb, but it would also expose my own knowledge about the piano's value and raise uncomfortable questions about why I had allowed the sale to proceed, despite understanding its implications. The legal research I conducted about potential remedies for fraudulent or deceptive business practices revealed that Marcus Webb's methods, while ethically questionable, were probably within the bounds of legal commercial activity. He had made an offer that the Rodriguez family had voluntarily accepted, and their failure to research the piano's value before agreeing to sell it didn't constitute grounds for rescinding the transaction or recovering damages for the difference between sale price and true worth. More importantly, pursuing legal action would have required admitting that I had possessed knowledge about the piano's value throughout the entire process, which would raise questions about my own culpability in allowing family members to make decisions based on incomplete information. The Rodriguez family's anger about being deceived by Marcus Webb would likely be exceeded by their fury about being deceived by me, and the resulting family conflict would probably destroy my marriage and relationships with people I still hoped might someday understand their mistakes. The strategic challenge was determining whether any purpose would be served by exposing Marcus Webb's deception and the upcoming auction, or whether revealing this information would simply create additional pain and conflict without recovering the piano, or preventing future exploitation of people who lacked expertise about what they owned. The instrument was gone, Brandon's business was failing predictably, and the Rodriguez family had already demonstrated their inability to acknowledge mistakes or learn from experiences that challenged their assumptions about their own judgment and decision-making capabilities. Instead of immediate confrontation, I decided to begin documenting the entire situation in detail, collecting evidence that would support whatever action I eventually decided to take while preserving my options for strategic revelation, when circumstances were most favorable for achieving meaningful change in family dynamics. The documentation process included saving screenshots of the auction listing, collecting information about Marcus Webb's business practices, and organizing financial records that demonstrated the true scope of what had been lost through the Rodriguez family's ignorance and manipulation. The most challenging aspect of maintaining secrecy while conducting this investigation was managing my growing anger about the systematic way my inheritance had been stolen through a combination of family pressure and deliberate deception by someone who specialized in exploiting exactly the circumstances the Rodriguez family had created. Every family dinner where Brandon provided optimistic updates about ecotech solutions felt like a performance designed to justify decisions that had enriched Marcus Webb while destroying something irreplaceable that connected me to my mother's memory and sacrifice. David's continued support for his family's handling of the piano sale became increasingly difficult to tolerate once I understood the full extent of what had actually occurred, and how completely they had been manipulated by someone whose business model depended on their particular combination of arrogance and ignorance. His willingness to accept their explanations about fair pricing and practical problem-solving revealed how little he understood about due diligence, professional appraisal, or the basic research that responsible people conducted before disposing of inherited items. The piano's upcoming auction was scheduled for late October, creating a natural deadline for deciding whether to reveal what I had discovered about Marcus Webb's deception and the instrument's true destination. Allowing the auction to proceed without warning the Rodriguez family would mean permanently losing any opportunity to recover my mother's piano, but it would also provide definitive proof of how completely they had misunderstood what they were handling when they casually agreed to solve their storage problem and Brandon's funding crisis with one convenient transaction. The months of investigation and documentation had provided ample evidence that the Rodriguez family's treatment of my inheritance reflected broader patterns of dismissal and manipulation that would likely continue affecting our relationships, regardless of whether they ever learned about the piano's true value or Marcus Webb's deceptive practices. Their systematic inability to recognize expertise or value outside their own limited experience suggested fundamental character issues that wouldn't be resolved through education about specific mistakes they had made. But the approaching auction also represented my last realistic opportunity to expose the truth about what had happened and potentially shame the Rodriguez family into acknowledging the scope of their ignorance and the damage caused by their assumptions about my inheritance and their own competence in evaluating things they didn't understand. The evidence I had collected would support a devastating presentation that revealed not only how much money they had lost through poor decision-making, but also how completely they had been deceived by someone who made his living from their particular type of arrogant ignorance. The decision about whether and how to reveal this information would ultimately determine not only the future of my relationships with David's family, but also whether I could live with myself for allowing people who had stolen something irreplaceable from me to continue believing they had acted appropriately and competently throughout the entire process. The approaching deadline for action was creating pressure to choose between maintaining family peace and demanding accountability for decisions that had cost me far more than they would ever understand. The evening of Frank Rodriguez's 65th birthday celebration arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that made Phoenix summers legendary for their brutality, but the family had planned an elaborate backyard barbecue that would showcase their new outdoor kitchen and demonstrate their success to friends and neighbors who formed their established social circle. Carol had spent weeks coordinating the menu, decorations, and guest list to ensure that Frank's milestone birthday would be remembered as a perfect example of Rodriguez family hospitality and achievement. The gathering would include approximately 60 people, ranging from longtime family friends to business associates from Frank's construction company, creating an audience that represented everything the Rodriguez family valued about their position within Phoenix's suburban establishment. I had spent the morning preparing my presentation materials with the same meticulous attention to detail that I brought to designing lesson plans for students with complex learning needs. The documentation I had gathered over the past months was organized into a comprehensive folder that told the complete story of what had happened to my mother's piano, from Walter Morrison's original Appraisal through Marcus Webb's predatory business practices to the upcoming auction where the instrument would likely sell for close to $1 million. Every piece of evidence was carefully arranged to create maximum impact while maintaining absolute factual accuracy that would be impossible for the Rodriguez family to dispute or explain away. The auction catalog from Hartwell Auctions had arrived 3 days earlier, featuring a full-color photograph of my mother's piano, alongside detailed technical specifications and historical analysis that emphasized its rarity and exceptional condition. The estimated bidding range of $400,000 to $1,200,000 was prominently displayed beneath a scholarly description that traced the instrument's provenance back to its original manufacture in 1923 and highlighted the preservation of original components that made it extraordinarily valuable to collectors and museums. Reading through the auction house's reverential treatment of my family heirloom, while knowing that the Rodriguez family had casually sold it for $3,500 to fund Brandon's failing business venture, created a surreal sense of cognitive dissonance that had been building for months. The same instrument that Carol dismissed as garage clutter was being presented to serious collectors as a museum-quality piece that represented one of the finest examples of early 20th century American piano manufacturing still available for private ownership. But perhaps the most infuriating aspect of the auction listing was the brief mention of the piano's recent ownership history, which described it as having been lovingly maintained by a family of musicians, without acknowledging that this family had consisted of 3 generations of women who had sacrificed financial security to preserve something beautiful for future generations. The auction house's sanitized language erased the personal cost of my mother's dedication, while marketing the results of her sacrifice to wealthy buyers who could afford to bid hundreds of thousands of dollars for a musical instrument. David's behavior throughout the morning of his father's birthday celebration revealed his complete obliviousness to the emotional significance of the occasion for me, and his continued assumption that my quiet demeanor reflected contentment with how family situations had been resolved. He spent considerable time helping with party preparations while making casual comments about how nice it was to see everyone coming together for such a happy celebration, apparently unaware that I was preparing to systematically destroy his family's self-perception and social standing within their established community. His casual mentions of Brandon's recent struggles with ecotech solutions were delivered with the kind of sympathetic concern that family members showed for relatives experiencing temporary setbacks rather than recognition that the consulting business had failed exactly as any realistic assessment would have predicted. David's willingness to continue supporting the fiction that Brandon's venture represented legitimate entrepreneurship rather than amateur experimentation funded by stolen inheritance money demonstrated how thoroughly he remained committed to his family's version of events, regardless of mounting evidence to the contrary. The early hours of the celebration proceeded exactly as Carol had planned, with guests arriving to find an elaborate spread of food and drinks arranged around the new outdoor kitchen that Frank had installed as a symbol of his construction company's success and his family's prosperity. The conversation flowed smoothly between topics that reinforced the Rodriguez family's position within Phoenix's suburban establishment, including discussions of local business developments, upcoming charity events, and shared memories of previous celebrations that had strengthened relationships within their extended social network. Brandon arrived fashionably late with his latest girlfriend, a young woman named Stephanie, who worked in marketing for a local fitness chain and seemed genuinely impressed by his descriptions of ecotech solutions and his plans for expanding into new markets. His presentation of himself as a successful entrepreneur was so confident and detailed that I found myself wondering whether he had begun to believe his own fiction about building a revolutionary environmental consulting business, despite months of evidence that contradicted every aspect of his projected timeline for growth and profitability. The interaction between Brandon and Frank during the early part of the celebration revealed the continuing family investment in maintaining the narrative that selling my mother's piano had been a wise decision that supported promising entrepreneurship while solving practical storage problems. Frank spoke with obvious pride about his nephew's business acumen and innovative thinking, while Brandon accepted congratulations for his success with the kind of gracious confidence that suggested someone who had completely divorced himself from objective assessment of actual achievements versus projected goals. Carol's introduction of Brandon to guests who hadn't met him before emphasized his role as the family's resident entrepreneur and innovative thinker, treating his environmental consulting venture as an established success story rather than a failing experiment that had consumed my inheritance without generating meaningful revenue or acquiring legitimate clients. Her enthusiasm for his achievements was so genuine and detailed that several guests expressed interest in learning more about ecotech solutions and potentially hiring Brandon's services for their own businesses. The most surreal aspect of watching this elaborate performance was understanding that every person at the celebration who praised Brandon's business accomplishments or expressed admiration for the Rodriguez family's support of entrepreneurship was participating in a collective delusion that had been funded by the destruction of something irreplaceable. The money that had purchased Brandon's expensive equipment and office space had been extracted from my family's legacy through a combination of systematic pressure and deliberate deception by someone who specialized in exploiting exactly the circumstances the Rodriguez family had created. Angela Martinez, Brandon's mother and Frank's sister, seemed particularly pleased with how well her son was being received by the Rodriguez family's social circle and business associates. Her comments about the importance of family support for young entrepreneurs were delivered with obvious satisfaction that her decision to encourage Brandon's move to Phoenix had resulted in exactly the kind of opportunities and connections that could advance his career prospects and establish his professional reputation within the local business community. What Angela didn't understand was that her son's apparent success was entirely dependent on maintaining fiction about ecotech solutions that would inevitably collapse once the startup money ran out, and Brandon was forced to confront the reality that his business model had no sustainable foundation for generating revenue or acquiring clients. The encouragement and investment he had received from the Rodriguez family had simply delayed this recognition, while providing him with enough resources to create elaborate illusions about achievement and progress. The conversation during dinner naturally turned toward Frank's career achievements and his pride in building Rodriguez Construction into one of Phoenix's most respected family-owned businesses. His reflections on 40 years of hard work and dedication were genuinely moving and demonstrated the kind of persistence and integrity that had earned him recognition within the local construction industry. Frank had built his success through competence, reliability, and honest dealing with clients who valued quality workmanship and fair pricing over flashy marketing or unrealistic promises. The contrast between Frank's legitimate business accomplishments and Brandon's elaborate pretense of entrepreneurial success was stark enough that I wondered how someone with such extensive experience in evaluating contractors and business partners could be so completely blind to the obvious signs that Ecotech Solutions was failing to meet even the most basic standards for operational viability. Frank's willingness to support Brandon's venture without applying the same scrutiny he would demand from any subcontractor or business associate revealed how family relationships could override professional judgment in ways that created opportunities for exploitation and deception. But the most painful aspect of listening to Frank's reflections on building successful businesses was understanding that his genuine achievements in construction and project management had been used to justify decisions about my inheritance that demonstrated complete ignorance about evaluation, appraisal, and the basic research that responsible people conducted before disposing of valuable items. His confidence in his own business judgment had prevented him from seeking professional advice that would have revealed how thoroughly he was being manipulated by Marcus Webb. As the evening progressed toward the cake ceremony and Frank's thank you speech to the assembled guests, I found myself experiencing a strange sense of calm that had been building throughout the weeks of preparation for this moment. The decision to expose the truth about what had happened to my mother's piano wasn't motivated by revenge or desire to humiliate people who had treated me poorly, but by recognition that allowing them to continue believing their own fiction about competence and family values would ultimately harm everyone involved while dishonoring my mother's memory and sacrifice. The documentation in my folder represented not just evidence of financial loss or family manipulation, but proof that systematic dismissal of expertise and value outside one's own limited experience created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by people who specialized in taking advantage of exactly these types of knowledge gaps. The Rodriguez family's treatment of my inheritance reflected broader patterns of arrogance and assumption that would continue affecting their decision-making and relationships until they were forced to confront the consequences of their own ignorance. When Frank finally stood to address his guests and thank them for sharing his special day, I understood that this was my moment to introduce information that would transform his celebration into something far more educational and much less comfortable for everyone involved. The timing was perfect because the assembled audience included exactly the people whose opinions mattered most to the Rodriguez family's self-perception and social standing within their established community. Before Frank continues with his speech, I said, rising from my seat with the folder of documentation in my hands, I have a special presentation that I think everyone will find interesting, particularly those involved in business and investment decisions. The sudden shift in conversation created a moment of uncertain silence as guests tried to interpret my intentions and the Rodriguez family processed the implications of my unexpected intervention in Frank's planned thank you remarks. As many of you know, I continued, maintaining perfect eye contact with Frank while addressing the assembled guests, the Rodriguez family has been very generous in sharing their opinions about practical decision-making and family priorities over the past few years. Tonight I'd like to return the favor by sharing some information about business evaluation and asset assessment that I think you'll find quite educational. The tension around the outdoor kitchen was immediate and palpable, as the implications of my announcement began to register with family members who understood that whatever I was planning to reveal had been carefully timed for maximum impact and minimum opportunity for intervention or damage control. Carol's face had gone pale, while Frank looked increasingly alarmed as he processed what was happening to his carefully planned celebration. 3 months ago, I said, opening the folder and removing Walter Morrison's official appraisal document, I had my mother's piano professionally evaluated by Morrison's Antique Appraisals here in Phoenix. Walter Morrison is a certified appraiser with over 40 years of experience in musical instruments and antiques, and his assessment of the piano that the Rodriguez family sold for $3,500 to fund Brandon's startup was quite illuminating. The mention of specific dollar amounts and professional credentials created immediate recognition among several guests who were familiar with both the piano sale and Brandon's environmental consulting venture. The connection between these two events, which had been presented as separate solutions to unrelated problems, was beginning to emerge as something far more complex and potentially troubling than anyone had understood. The instrument that was casually dismissed as garage clutter and sold to help launch Ecotech Solutions, I continued, removing the auction catalog and holding it up for everyone to see, was actually a 1923 Steinway Model M Baby Grand, one of fewer than 300 pianos produced during a specific period when the company was experimenting with soundboard construction techniques that were never replicated. The detailed technical specifications from Walter Morrison's appraisal were met with stunned silence as guests processed information that revealed the complete scope of what had been lost through the Rodriguez family's ignorance and haste. Several people who were familiar with musical instruments or antique collecting looked genuinely shocked as they understood the implications of selling such a valuable piece for a fraction of its true worth. Walter Morrison's conservative estimated value for my mother's piano, I said, allowing the words to hang in the air before delivering the devastating conclusion, was $847,000, with notation that similar instruments have sold at recent auctions for well over $1 million when accompanied by proper provenance documentation. The silence that followed this revelation was absolute, as everyone present struggled to process the magnitude of what I was telling them. Frank Rodriguez looked like he might collapse as he understood that his confident handling of the piano sale had actually cost our family nearly $1 million, through his failure to conduct basic research or seek professional appraisal before agreeing to dispose of inherited property. Brandon's face had gone ashen as he realized that his startup funding had been extracted from my family's legacy through a transaction that represented one of the most devastating financial mistakes in recent memory. The environmental consulting venture that he had presented as innovative entrepreneurship was revealed as amateur experimentation, funded by the destruction of something irreplaceable and extraordinarily valuable. But the story gets even more interesting, I continued, removing documentation about Marcus Webb's business practices and the upcoming auction. The buyer who purchased my mother's piano for $3,500 wasn't a music lover or collector who would appreciate its historical significance. Marcus Webb is a professional flipper who specializes in identifying undervalued items being sold by people who lack expertise about what they own. The information about Marcus Webb's predatory business model created another wave of shocked recognition, as guests understood that the Rodriguez family hadn't simply made a mistake based on ignorance, but had been deliberately targeted and manipulated by someone whose livelihood depended on exploiting exactly their particular combination of arrogance and assumption about their own competence in evaluating valuable items. Marcus Webb immediately recognized what he was purchasing when Frank contacted him about an old Steinway taking up garage space, I explained, displaying screenshots of Webb's business website and customer testimonials that revealed his systematic approach to acquiring valuable items at fraction of their true worth. His offer of $3,500 was a calculated lowball bid designed to take advantage of your ignorance while providing enough money to make you feel satisfied with the transaction. Frank Rodriguez attempted to speak but seemed unable to form coherent words as he confronted evidence that his pride in finding a buyer through his business network had actually led him directly to a predator who had identified an opportunity to profit from exactly the type of transaction he had initiated. His satisfaction with receiving $3,500 for garage clutter had played perfectly into Marcus Webb's standard operating procedures for acquiring valuable items at minimal cost. The most fascinating part, I said, removing the auction catalog and displaying the full-color photograph of my mother's piano alongside its estimated bidding range, is seeing how Marcus Webb has already listed the piano with Hartwell Auctions in Los Angeles, where it's expected to sell for between $400,000 and $2 million next month. The auction listing provided visual proof of everything I had been explaining, showing the same instrument that Carol had dismissed as an eyesore being presented to serious collectors as a museum-quality piece that represented one of the finest examples of early 20th century American piano manufacturing still available for private ownership. The contrast between the Rodriguez family's casual disposal and the auction house's reverential treatment was so stark that several guests audibly gasped as they processed the implications. So in summary, I said, addressing the assembled guests while maintaining eye contact with each Rodriguez family member, the practical decision-making and business acumen that you've all admired tonight resulted in giving away nearly $1 million to fund a consulting business that has acquired 0 clients and generated 0 revenue over the past 6 months. Brandon Martinez looked like he wanted to disappear as guests turned to stare at him with expressions ranging from sympathy to disgust. His confident presentations about ecotech solutions and his plans for expanding into new markets were revealed as elaborate fiction designed to justify the consumption of startup money that had been extracted from my family's legacy through systematic manipulation and deception. The environmental consulting venture that was supposed to benefit from this generous family support, I continued, removing documentation about Brandon's actual business activities, has spent the entire $3,500 on office rent, equipment purchases, and networking events without acquiring a single paying client or completing any projects that generated revenue. The evidence of Brandon's failure to achieve even the most basic milestones for business development created another wave of uncomfortable recognition among guests who had listened to his optimistic presentations and expressed interest. His elaborate fiction about innovative thinking and market opportunities was collapsing in real time as people understood that they had been witnessing amateur experimentation rather than legitimate entrepreneurship. David finally found his voice, though it came out as more of a strangled whisper than his usual confident tone. "Emma, this is completely inappropriate. These are private family matters that shouldn't be discussed in front of guests." "Actually, David," I replied, turning to face him directly, "these are public consequences of decisions that your family made about my inheritance without conducting basic research or seeking professional advice. Everyone here deserves to understand what really happened before they consider investing their own money in ventures that are presented with such confidence despite lacking any foundation in reality." Carol Rodriguez attempted damage control by suggesting that family financial discussions were inappropriate for social gatherings, but her objection was met with obvious skepticism from guests who recognized that the information I was sharing had significant implications for anyone considering business relationships with family members who had demonstrated such spectacular incompetence in evaluation and decision-making. "The most important lesson here," I said, addressing the entire gathering while preparing to reveal even more devastating information, "is understanding the difference between confident ignorance and actual expertise." The Rodriguez family spent months analyzing my attachment to my mother's piano as evidence of emotional problems that needed intervention, while simultaneously embracing Brandon's grandiose business claims with enthusiasm that ignored every warning sign of inevitable failure. But what I hadn't yet shared with the assembled guests was the full extent of my investigation into exactly how the Rodriguez family had been manipulated and deceived throughout the entire process. The documentation I had gathered revealed a pattern of systematic exploitation that went far beyond Marcus Webb's individual deception, to include a network of people who specialized in identifying and targeting families exactly like the Rodriguez clan. "What makes this situation even more educational," I continued, removing another set of documents from my folder, "is understanding how thoroughly the Rodriguez family was targeted and manipulated by people who make their living from exactly this type of arrogance and ignorance about asset evaluation." The investigation I had conducted over the past months had revealed that Marcus Webb was part of a loose network of dealers, auction houses, and intermediaries who shared information about potential targets and coordinated their efforts to maximize profits from people who lacked expertise about valuable items they inherited or possessed. The Rodriguez family hadn't been randomly approached by a buyer. They had been specifically identified as ideal marks through a systematic process that evaluated their wealth, social connections, and likely ignorance about antiques and collectibles. "Frank," I said, addressing him directly while displaying documentation about the targeting process, "when you mentioned to your golf partner Robert Chen that you had an old piano taking up garage space, did you know that Robert has a business relationship with Marcus Webb that involves identifying potential sellers who might not understand what they own?" The revelation that Frank's casual conversation with a trusted friend had actually initiated a carefully orchestrated exploitation scheme created another wave of shocked recognition among guests who understood that the Rodriguez family had been systematically deceived by people they considered part of their social and business network. Robert Chen, who was present at the celebration, looked mortified as guests turned to stare at him with expressions of disgust and betrayal. His role in connecting Frank with Marcus Webb had been presented as helpful networking between friends. But the reality was far more calculated and predatory than anyone had understood. "Robert receives a finder's fee for every successful transaction that results from his referrals to Marcus Webb," I explained, displaying documentation about their business arrangement that had been carefully hidden from the families they targeted. Their support provided validation that my decision to reveal the facts had been appropriate and necessary rather than vindictive or unnecessarily destructive. Robert Chen, whose role in connecting Frank with Marcus Webb had been exposed as part of a systematic exploitation scheme, left the celebration immediately without speaking to anyone, clearly understanding that his reputation within the community had been permanently damaged by revelations about his participation in predatory business practices that targeted friends and social connections. Margaret Thompson from Carol's book club also departed quickly, avoiding conversations that might have led to uncomfortable questions about her role in gathering intelligence about valuable items that club members might be willing to sell to dealers who specialized in exploiting exactly the type of ignorance the Rodriguez family had demonstrated. The social dynamics at the celebration shifted dramatically as guests began reassessing their relationships with family members who had proven capable of such spectacular misjudgment, while maintaining elaborate fiction about their own competence and decision-making capabilities. Conversations became strained and formal as people processed information that challenged their previous assumptions about the Rodriguez family's reliability and trustworthiness. Frank Rodriguez's attempts to resume his planned birthday speech were met with polite but distracted attention from guests who were clearly more interested in discussing the implications of what they had learned than celebrating his milestone achievement. The evening that was supposed to showcase his success and family values had become a cautionary tale about the consequences of arrogance and dismissal of expert advice. Carol Rodriguez spent the remainder of the celebration attempting damage control through private conversations with individual guests, but her efforts were undermined by the comprehensive nature of the evidence I had presented and the obvious accuracy of every detail that could be independently verified through public records and professional sources. Brandon Martinez and his girlfriend departed the celebration early, avoiding the uncomfortable conversations that would have required explaining how his environmental consulting venture had consumed nearly $1 million worth of family heritage, without generating any meaningful results or acquiring legitimate clients. His elaborate fiction about innovative entrepreneurship had been exposed as systematic deception designed to extract resources from relatives who valued business ambition over due diligence. David Rodriguez remained at the celebration but seemed increasingly isolated as guests processed information about his role in supporting his family's decisions despite mounting evidence that contradicted their assumptions about value and competence. His previous confidence in defending family judgment was replaced by obvious discomfort with the social consequences of their spectacular misjudgment. The weeks following Frank Rodriguez's birthday celebration were characterized by systematic social and professional consequences as news of the piano auction spread throughout Phoenix's business and social community. People who had trusted the Rodriguez family's judgment began questioning whether individuals capable of such devastating mistakes possessed the competence necessary for important business relationships and social connections. Rodriguez Construction experienced immediate challenges as existing clients and potential customers learned about Frank's role in disposing of nearly $1 million worth of inherited property without conducting basic research or seeking professional appraisal. The construction industry's emphasis on careful evaluation and risk assessment made Frank's demonstrated incompetence particularly problematic for maintaining professional relationships and acquiring new projects. Several business associates who had considered investment opportunities or partnership arrangements with Rodriguez Construction withdrew their interest after learning about the systematic poor judgment that had characterized Frank's handling of family financial decisions. The concern was that someone who could make such devastating mistakes about asset evaluation might also demonstrate poor judgment in construction planning, cost estimation, and project management. Carol Rodriguez's position within Phoenix's social community was similarly affected, as friends and social connections processed information about her role in pressuring family members to sell inherited property without understanding its value or significance. Her reputation for practical decision-making and sound judgment was permanently damaged by evidence that she had systematically dismissed expert advice while pursuing courses of action based on assumption and social pressure. The book club that Carol had participated in for over a decade experienced significant tension as members learned about Margaret Thompson's role in gathering intelligence about valuable items that might be available for purchase by dealers who specialized in exploiting families like the Rodriguez clan. The revelation that their educational presentations had been reconnaissance missions created lasting suspicion about the motives and connections of other members who had access to information about personal possessions and financial situations. Brandon Martinez's environmental consulting business collapsed entirely as potential clients learned about his systematic deception regarding business activities and revenue generation. His elaborate presentations about ecotech solutions were revealed as fiction designed to justify consumption of family resources rather than legitimate business development, making it impossible for him to maintain credibility within the environmental consulting industry. The broader Phoenix business community began using the Rodriguez family's experience as a cautionary tale about the importance of professional consultation and expert advice when dealing with inherited property or valuable assets. Their spectacular misjudgment became a standard reference point for discussing the consequences of arrogance and assumption in situations requiring specialized knowledge and careful evaluation. 6 months after the birthday celebration, I received official notification that my mother's piano had sold at Hartwell Auctions for $1.23 million to a private collector who specialized in preserving exceptional musical instruments for future generations. The final sale price exceeded even Walter Morrison's optimistic projections, and confirmed everything I had shared about the instrument's extraordinary value and historical significance. Marcus Webb's profit from the transaction exceeded $1.2 million after auction fees and expenses were calculated, demonstrating exactly how profitable systematic exploitation of families like the Rodriguez clan could be for people who possessed expertise about identifying and acquiring undervalued items. His business model was entirely legal, but ethically questionable, representing sophisticated predatory practices that targeted people during vulnerable periods when they needed money quickly and couldn't afford professional appraisal services. The Rodriguez family never recovered their social standing or professional reputation within Phoenix's established community, as the systematic nature of their misjudgment and dismissal of expert advice created lasting concerns about their competence and reliability in other areas where people might consider business or social relationships. Their experience became a permanent reminder about the importance of humility, professional consultation, and realistic assessment of one's own limitations when dealing with complex decisions or valuable assets. David and I divorced 1 year after his father's birthday celebration, not because of anger about the piano or desire for revenge against his family, but because the evening's revelations had exposed fundamental incompatibilities in our values and judgment that made continuing our marriage impossible. His willingness to support family decisions without conducting basic research or seeking professional advice reflected character traits that extended far beyond a single mistake about evaluating inherited property. The most significant long-term outcome was establishing a precedent for recognizing and responding to systematic dismissal of expertise and value outside established social hierarchies. The Rodriguez family's treatment of my inheritance represented institutional attitudes about recognizing achievement and respecting knowledge that affect countless families and relationships, where assumptions about competence and authority prevent recognition of value and significance. My mother's piano had served its final purpose by revealing the true character of people who had presented themselves as practical decision-makers and supportive family members, while systematically exploiting relationships and inherited property for their own convenience and benefit. The lesson was expensive but educational for everyone involved, though some people learned more than others about the importance of humility, research, and professional advice when dealing with things they don't understand. The broader implications of what had occurred extended far beyond personal vindication or family conflict, to include recognition that confident ignorance creates systematic vulnerabilities that can be exploited by people who specialize in taking advantage of exactly these types of knowledge gaps. The Rodriguez family's experience demonstrated how arrogance and dismissal of expert advice make people ideal targets for predatory practices, while preventing them from accessing help and information that could protect their interests and assets. The documentation I had compiled throughout the process became a valuable resource for other families who suspected they might be targets of similar exploitation schemes. The systematic approach I had used to gather evidence and expose predatory practices provided a template for recognizing and responding to situations where valuable assets were being undervalued, or families were being manipulated by people who specialized in exploiting knowledge gaps and emotional vulnerabilities. Professional appraisers and auction houses began using the Rodriguez family's experience as an educational example about the importance of seeking expert advice before disposing of inherited property or making decisions about valuable assets. Their spectacular misjudgment became a standard case study for discussing the consequences of assumption and ignorance in situations requiring specialized knowledge and careful evaluation. The Phoenix business community implemented informal networks for sharing information about predatory practices and individuals who specialized in exploiting families during vulnerable periods, when they possessed valuable items without understanding market dynamics or professional valuation processes. The Rodriguez family's experience contributed to increased awareness about systematic exploitation, while providing practical guidance about protecting assets and relationships from similar predatory schemes. The most lasting tribute to my mother's memory was ensuring that her piano's final sale provided educational value that would help other families avoid similar exploitation, while honoring the sacrifices she had made to preserve something beautiful for future generations. Her dedication to music and education continued through the lessons learned from how her legacy had been treated by people who failed to understand or respect its significance and value. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up.